Hey everyone, welcome back to Nightmare Reads. Tonight, we're stepping into the lonely and unpredictable world of long-haul truckers where empty highways, isolated rest stops, and heavy rain can hide things no driver expects to find. Before we begin, subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy realistic, atmospheric horror stories. And this Saturday night at 10 p.m., we're releasing a special 8-story rain compilation made especially for the truckers listening out there. For now, turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and let's get into tonight's stories. My name is Mike, and I'm a long-haul truck driver based out of Toledo, Ohio. I've been driving commercially for a little over 8 years, mostly running freight between the Midwest and the West Coast. When you spend that much time on the interstate, you eventually learn that the road feels completely different after midnight. During the day, everything looks normal. Gas stations are crowded, traffic is moving, and there are people everywhere. But at 2 or 3 in the morning, especially during bad weather, even a familiar highway can feel isolated. This happened about 3 years ago, while I was hauling a sealed dry van load from Sacramento to a distribution center outside Salt Lake City. I had taken Interstate 80 through Reno and planned to keep driving for another hour before shutting down. According to my GPS, there was a large truck stop farther east where I could park, grab something to eat, and take my required break. The problem was the weather. The rain had started lightly outside Reno, but within 20 minutes, it turned into a full storm. Water was hitting my windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, and every time another truck passed me, it threw up a wall of spray that completely blocked my view. I slowed down, but I was already exhausted. I'd been driving most of the day, and my eyes had started burning from staring through the windshield. I caught myself drifting toward the rumble strip twice. That was enough for me. A tired driver can be just as dangerous as a drunk one, so when I saw a blue rest area sign coming up, I decided to pull over. The place was small and old. It wasn't one of those newer travel plazas with security cameras and bright LED lights. It was basically a narrow parking lot, a restroom building, a few vending machines, and enough space for maybe 15 trucks. Only 3 other semis were parked there. 2 were sitting near the entrance, and another one was backed into the far corner with its marker lights off. Most of the overhead lights weren't working. The few that were still on flickered every couple of seconds, making the rain look like silver lines falling through the darkness. I remember thinking the place looked sketchy, but I was too tired to care. I found a spot along the back row and backed in. Before shutting down, I checked my mirrors and looked around the lot. I didn't see anyone walking nearby. I locked both cab doors, pulled the curtains across the windshield, and climbed into the sleeper. My truck had storage compartments underneath the lower bunk. Most of that space could be reached from inside by lifting the mattress, but there were also exterior doors on both sides of the sleeper. I normally kept tools, spare boots, cleaning supplies, and a few emergency items in there. That night, I didn't check those compartments. I had inspected them earlier in the day, and as far as I knew, they were locked. I changed out of my wet jacket, set an alarm on my phone, and lay down. The rain was pounding against the roof so hard that it drowned out nearly every other sound. Every few minutes, a gust of wind rocked the cab slightly. I fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime later, I woke up without knowing why. At first, I assumed my alarm had gone off, but the sleeper was completely dark. I reached toward my phone and checked the time. It was 3:17 in the morning. I had been asleep for less than an hour. I lay there listening to the storm and tried to figure out what had woken me. Then, I heard a soft scraping sound underneath me. It was faint, almost like a cardboard box sliding a few inches across the floor. I froze for a second, but then I told myself it was probably one of my tools moving around in the storage compartment. The parking area wasn't perfectly level, and the wind was shaking the truck. I rolled onto my side and closed my eyes. A few seconds later, the mattress moved. It wasn't dramatic. It only lifted slightly beneath my shoulder and then settled back down. That got my attention. I sat up and stared at the bottom of the bunk, even though I couldn't see anything in the darkness. I listened. For nearly 30 seconds, there was nothing except the rain. Then came a slow creak from directly underneath the mattress. It sounded like someone shifting their weight. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. The lower bunk in that truck sat directly above the storage compartment. Between me and whatever was inside it, there was only the mattress, a wooden support panel, and a thin metal frame. I wanted to turn on the sleeper light, but I was afraid of what I might see. Instead, I reached for my phone and lowered the brightness all the way down. I opened the camera and pointed it toward the edge of the bunk, thinking I might be able to see something through the small gaps near the hinges. The screen showed nothing but darkness. Then I heard breathing. It was slow and uneven. At first, I wondered whether I was somehow hearing my own breath echoing inside the sleeper. I held my breath to check. The breathing continued. Someone was underneath my bed. I didn't know how long they had been there. They could have climbed in while I was fueling earlier that night. They could have entered when I stopped to inspect my tires near Sacramento. Or they could have been hiding in that rest area, waiting for a driver to park. The thought that scared me most was that I had no idea whether the person had been inside the compartment while I was driving. I stayed completely still and tried to think. The passenger door was only a few feet away, but climbing out of the bunk would mean putting my feet on the floor directly beside the compartment opening. I didn't know whether the person had a weapon. I also didn't know whether the interior panel could be pushed open from below. My first instinct was to grab the tire thumper I kept near the driver's seat, but reaching it meant crawling out of the sleeper. I decided not to risk it. I opened the emergency call screen on my phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, I spoke as quietly as I could. I gave her the rest area location and told her I was inside a semi-truck with someone hiding beneath the sleeper bunk. She asked whether I could safely leave the truck. I whispered that I didn't think so. While she was speaking, something underneath the mattress shifted suddenly. The entire bunk lifted about half an inch and dropped back into place. I stopped talking. The dispatcher asked if I was still there, but I couldn't answer. Whoever was below me had heard my voice. The breathing stopped. For some reason, that silence frightened me more than the breathing had. Before, I at least knew where the person was. Now I pictured them lying completely still, listening to every movement I made. The dispatcher told me that officers were on the way and instructed me to stay inside with the doors locked. I kept the phone pressed against my ear and stared toward the end of the bunk. A minute passed. Then 2. It felt much longer. The storm made it impossible to hear anything outside. Every time headlights moved across the curtains, I thought the police had arrived, but it was only another vehicle passing on the interstate. Then, I heard a metallic click below me. It sounded like someone testing the latch on the interior storage panel. I slowly backed toward the wall of the sleeper. The panel moved slightly. Not enough to open, but enough for me to see a thin black gap appear beneath the mattress frame. I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, which happened to be a large metal flashlight. I held it above my shoulder, ready to swing. The panel stopped moving. For another 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard movement toward the passenger side of the truck. There was a dull bump, followed by another click. The exterior compartment door flew open. I felt cold air rush through the gaps around the bunk. The entire truck shook as someone crawled out. I moved toward the front of the cab and pulled the curtain aside just enough to look through the passenger window. A man was crouched beside the truck. The rain was pouring over him. He wore a dark hooded jacket, dirty jeans, and a large backpack strapped tightly against his shoulders. For a second, he didn't run. He stood up slowly and looked directly at the passenger window. I don't know whether he could see me through the curtain, but it felt like he knew exactly where I was. Then, red and blue lights appeared near the entrance to the rest area. The man turned and ran between the parked trucks. 2 patrol vehicles entered the lot from opposite directions. One officer stopped near my truck, while the other drove toward the back of the parking area. I stayed inside until someone knocked on my driver's side door and identified himself as a state trooper. When I finally opened the door, my legs were shaking so badly that I had to hold on to the steering wheel while climbing down. The officers searched the rest area for almost 20 minutes. They found the man hiding underneath the trailer of the truck parked in the far corner. He had a folding hunting knife clipped inside his waistband, a flashlight, gloves, and several small items that didn't belong to him, including 2 wallets and a truck stop fuel card. One of the officers inspected my storage compartment. The lock on the passenger side exterior door had been damaged. It looked closed from the outside, but the latch no longer caught properly. The officer believed the man had opened it with a flat tool and climbed inside sometime after I parked. There wasn't much room under the bunk, especially with my equipment stored there, but he had moved several things aside and curled himself into the remaining space. The officer couldn't say exactly what the man intended to do. Maybe he only wanted shelter from the storm. Maybe he planned to steal whatever he could find once I fell asleep. Or maybe he was waiting for me to leave the cab. I still think about the knife. The next morning, I found a muddy handprint on the inside of the storage panel, directly beneath where my head had been resting. That detail bothered me more than anything else. At some point during the night, while I was sleeping, his hand had been less than a foot away from my face. I had the compartment lock replaced before continuing the trip. I also bought a small alarm sensor for both exterior doors. Since then, I've developed a routine every time I stop for the night. I walk around the entire truck. I check the trailer seal, look underneath the chassis, and physically pull on every storage door to make sure it's locked. Even after doing all of that, I sometimes lie awake listening for movement beneath the bunk. A few months after the incident, I drove through that same stretch of Interstate 80 during another rainstorm. I had plenty of driving hours left, but when I saw the sign for that rest area, I kept going. I haven't stopped there since, and whenever I hear something shift beneath my mattress at night, even if I know it's only a tool sliding around, I still hold my breath and listen for someone else breathing back. My name is Dave, and I'm a long-haul truck driver based out of Jacksonville, Florida. I've been driving for almost 12 years, and for most of that time, I hauled refrigerated freight. Produce, frozen meat, dairy products, anything that needed to stay at a controlled temperature went into what drivers call a reefer. After enough years pulling one, you get used to the sound of the refrigeration unit. It cycles on and off all night, sometimes shaking the entire sleeper when the compressor kicks in. A lot of drivers complain about the noise, but for me, it became background sound. I actually had trouble sleeping whenever the unit wasn't running. That changed after something happened to me in Colorado 3 years ago. It was near the end of November. I had delivered a frozen food load to a warehouse outside Denver and was running empty toward a yard near Pueblo, where I was supposed to pick up another trailer the following morning. The warehouse crew had unloaded everything, and I had personally swept out the trailer before leaving. The reefer unit was shut off. The trailer was empty, and both rear door latches were secured with a small padlock. The weather had been getting worse all evening. It wasn't snowing yet. It was that miserable freezing rain that sticks to the windshield and forms a thin layer of ice along the mirrors. Traffic on the interstate had slowed to a crawl, and several cars had already slid onto the shoulder. I had enough driving hours left to reach Pueblo, but fatigue was starting to catch up with me. My shoulders were tight from gripping the wheel, and every pair of headlights coming toward me seemed twice as bright through the rain. I decided it wasn't worth pushing it. A few miles outside a small town, I saw a weathered sign advertising fuel and food. I followed it onto a narrow county road and found an old gas station sitting by itself between a closed repair shop and a field. The place had one diesel pump and a tiny convenience store attached to it. Only half of the exterior lights were working. There was enough room behind the building for maybe 2 tractor trailers. A rusted dumpster sat near the fence, and beyond that was nothing but dark farmland. I went inside to ask whether I could park there for a few hours. The man behind the counter looked like he was getting ready to close. He told me it was fine as long as I stayed away from the delivery entrance. I bought coffee, a bottle of water, and a microwave sandwich. Before walking back to the cab, I inspected the truck. Ice had already started collecting around the trailer hinges. I checked both door handles, pulled on the padlock, and looked beneath the trailer with my flashlight. Everything appeared normal. I parked behind the station, set the brakes, and shut down the engine. Without the reefer unit running, the silence felt strange. All I could hear was rain tapping against the roof and water draining from the trailer onto the gravel. I ate half the sandwich, set my alarm for 5 in the morning, and climbed into the sleeper. I don't remember falling asleep. The next thing I remember was opening my eyes in complete darkness. For a moment, I didn't know what had woken me. Then, the truck moved. It wasn't the gentle rocking caused by wind. It felt like something had hit the trailer hard enough to send a vibration through the fifth wheel and into the cab. A second later, I heard a dull impact behind me. Thump. I stayed still and listened. The rain was coming down harder, and a gust of wind pushed against the passenger side of the cab. I assumed a loose load strap or cleaning tool had fallen over inside the trailer. Then, I remembered that I had removed everything when I swept it out. There was nothing inside that trailer. I checked the time. It was 2:48 in the morning. I sat up and waited. Almost a full minute passed without another sound. I was starting to convince myself It had been a chunk of ice falling from the roof when the impact came again. Thump. This one was harder. The sleeper wall vibrated behind my head. Then there were 3 quick knocks. Thump, thump, thump. They were evenly spaced. That was not ice. Someone or something was hitting the inside of my trailer. I pulled the curtain back from the driver's side window and checked my mirror. From the cab, I couldn't see the rear doors, but I could see the side of the trailer. It was moving slightly, even though the wind had stopped. The suspension shifted as if weight was moving near the back. My first thought was cargo theft. Thieves sometimes target parked trailers, especially in isolated areas. But mine was empty. Even if someone had broken in, there was nothing worth stealing. I reached for the flashlight and heavy tire thumper I kept beside the driver's seat. For about 10 seconds, I considered getting out and checking the doors myself. Then I heard another sound. It was faint and muffled, but it came from behind the sleeper. A long, rough exhale. At first, it sounded like air leaking from a brake line. I checked the gauges. The air pressure was holding steady. The sound came again. This time, it ended with what sounded like a cough. There was a person inside the trailer. I grabbed my phone and called 911. I gave the dispatcher the name of the gas station and explained that someone appeared to be trapped or hiding inside my empty refrigerated trailer. She asked whether the trailer had been empty when I parked. I told her I had swept it myself and locked the doors less than 4 hours earlier. She instructed me to remain inside the cab and keep both doors locked. While I was speaking to her, something struck the trailer wall again. Then a voice called out. I couldn't understand the words. The trailer walls and heavy insulation distorted everything, turning the voice into a low, muffled groan. I leaned toward the back of the sleeper. Hey. I shouted. Police are coming. The banging stopped immediately. That reaction made me uncomfortable. Someone who was accidentally trapped would probably keep yelling for help. Whoever was inside had gone silent as soon as I mentioned the police. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me. I turned on my headlights and watched the mirrors. Nothing moved outside. A few minutes later, I saw a dark figure near the corner of the gas station building. He appeared for only a second before stepping behind the dumpster. I told the dispatcher there might be another person outside. She asked me to describe him, but I had only seen a jacket and what looked like a hood. I locked the cab again, even though I had already checked both doors twice. The figure didn't reappear. Then, the trailer rocked violently. Metal scraped against metal near the back, followed by a heavy crash. I started the engine. I wasn't planning to drive away with someone inside, but I wanted the option if the person outside approached my cab. A hand suddenly struck the passenger window. I nearly jumped out of the seat. A man was standing on the step below the door. He wore a dark rain jacket and had a scarf covering the lower half of his face. Water streamed off his hood as he pulled on the locked handle. I leaned on the horn. He stepped down immediately and ran toward the rear of the trailer. Through the side mirror, I watched him disappear behind it. The trailer began rocking again. I could hear metal rattling near the rear doors. It sounded like he was trying to open them. I put the transmission into gear and released the tractor brakes, but the dispatcher told me patrol cars were less than a minute away. Blue lights appeared on the county road before I had to move. 2 sheriff's vehicles entered the lot. One stopped beside my cab, while the second drove around the other side of the building. The man behind the trailer tried to run into the field. He made it less than 50 yards before slipping on the frozen ground. A deputy caught up with him near the fence. Another deputy approached my truck and asked me to remain in the cab while they checked the trailer. From my mirror, I watched him shine a flashlight over the rear doors. The padlock was gone. It had been cut, and one of the latch handles had been partially lifted. A small piece of metal had been wedged into the locking mechanism, preventing the door from closing completely. The deputies opened both doors. A second man was crouched inside near the front wall. He was soaked, shivering, and holding a short pry bar. The inside of the trailer wasn't as cold as an active freezer, but the aluminum walls had held on to the outside temperature. His wet clothing had made the cold much more dangerous. An ambulance was called to examine him. Both men initially claimed they had entered the trailer to get out of the storm. That explanation might have made sense if they had simply broken in and gone to sleep. But the deputies found bolt cutters, pry bars, several cut padlocks, and 2 fuel cards in their backpacks. They also found a large knife on the man who had climbed onto my passenger step. One of the deputies believed the men had been checking parked trailers for anything they could steal. They had probably cut my lock shortly after the gas station closed. The second man entered the trailer, while his partner stayed outside as a lookout. When the wind pushed one of the doors shut, the damaged latch caught just enough to trap him inside. The knocking I heard was him trying to signal his partner without attracting my attention. The breathing sound had been real too. Cold air was passing through the narrow, opening around the damaged latch, carrying the trapped man's coughing and wheezing along the side of the trailer toward the cab. The part that disturbed me most was what the deputy said after searching the outside of the truck. There were muddy prints beside both cab doors. The men had walked around the tractor before breaking into the trailer. They had tested my door handles while I was sleeping. One print was directly below the sleeper emergency exit. The deputy couldn't tell me whether they had been planning to enter the cab, but he strongly suggested I replace the locks and have the entire truck inspected. I stayed in the gas station parking lot until sunrise. The owner returned just after 6 and gave the deputies access to an old security camera mounted over the fuel pump. The footage was grainy, but it showed both men approaching my truck at around 2:20 in the morning. For nearly 10 minutes, they circled the tractor and trailer. At one point, one of them stood beside the sleeper while the other tried the driver's side door. I had been asleep less than 2 feet away. After that night, I stopped parking at small, isolated fuel stations unless I had no other choice. I also began carrying better locks and installing inexpensive door alarms on the trailer. I continued hauling refrigerated freight for a few more months, but I never got comfortable with it again. Whenever the reefer unit shut off during the night, I would wake up and listen. Sometimes I thought I heard movement inside the trailer. Sometimes I thought I heard that same rough breathing passing through the door seals. Eventually, I requested dry freight and never switched back. People ask why that incident bothered me so much when the deputies caught both men and nobody was hurt. The truth is, it wasn't the person trapped inside the trailer that stayed with me. It was the security footage. It was watching 2 strangers walk around my truck in the freezing rain, quietly testing every possible way to get inside while I slept. And knowing that if the man in the trailer hadn't accidentally trapped himself, I might never have woken up at all. My name is Sarah, and I'm a long-haul truck driver based out of Flagstaff, Arizona. I've been driving commercially for a little over 10 years. Most of my routes take me through the western states: Arizona, Nevada, California, Oregon, and Washington. People who have never driven a truck usually think the hardest part is handling the size of the vehicle. It isn't. You get used to the length, the weight, and the blind spots. What you never fully get used to is the isolation. There are nights when you can drive for hours without speaking to another person. Your dispatcher becomes a name on a screen. The warehouses become sets of locked gates, and the only sounds you hear are your engine, your tires, and whatever is moving behind you in the trailer. This happened last winter while I was working for a small freight company out of Phoenix. I had delivered a load of packaged food to a warehouse in Portland, Oregon. I was supposed to pick up a return load the following afternoon. But just before midnight, my dispatcher called and offered me another job. A customer had a trailer sitting at a transfer yard in an industrial area south of Portland. The driver assigned to it had reportedly become sick and left the truck at a nearby motel. My dispatcher wanted me to hook onto the trailer and take it to a freight terminal outside Klamath Falls. The load was listed as salvaged household goods. According to the electronic bill of lading, the trailer contained damaged furniture, clothing donations, boxed kitchenware, and other items recovered from a closed storage facility. The estimated cargo weight was around 18,000 pounds. It wasn't a great paying load, but it put me in the right direction for my next pickup, so I accepted it. When I reached the transfer yard, the rain was coming down hard. The yard itself was little more than a fenced gravel lot surrounded by warehouses. There was no guard booth and no one waiting to meet me. My dispatcher texted me the gate code and the trailer number. I found it parked near the back fence. It was an older white dry van with faded lettering from a company I didn't recognize. Mud covered the lower half of the doors, and one of the red marker lights near the roof was out. I backed under it, connected the air and electrical lines, then performed a basic inspection. The tires looked usable. The landing gear came up normally. The rear doors were secured with a numbered plastic seal that matched the paperwork. Nothing appeared obviously wrong. Still, something about the trailer bothered me. The bill of lading looked incomplete. It listed the general cargo category and destination, but the section that normally identified the original shipper had been left blank. Instead, someone had entered the name of a freight broker I had never heard of. I called my dispatcher and asked about it. He sounded irritated. He told me it was a recovery load and that the broker had already approved the documents. As long as the seal number matched, he said, I didn't need to worry about the details. I should have refused the load right there. Experienced drivers know that paperwork protects us. If the cargo doesn't match the bill of lading, the driver can still end up answering questions. But it was after midnight. I had already connected to the trailer, and my dispatcher assured me everything had been cleared. I took photographs of the seal and paperwork, sent them to myself, and left the yard. The plan was to drive south on Interstate 5, stop for my break near Eugene, and continue toward Klamath Falls in the morning. The rain became heavier as soon as I left the Portland area. Water collected in the tire tracks, pulling at the steering whenever I changed lanes. Every passing truck threw sheets of spray across my windshield. The trailer also felt wrong. 18,000 pounds isn't extremely heavy, but it should have given the trailer some stability. Instead, I could feel the cargo shifting whenever I took a curve. It wasn't a major movement, just a small delayed pull from the rear, as though something inside was rolling from one side to the other. I reduced my speed and kept both hands on the wheel. About 45 minutes outside Portland, I heard the first sound. It was a dull thump from somewhere near the front of the trailer. I felt it through the fifth wheel before I heard it. I assumed a piece of furniture had come loose. Salvage loads aren't always packed properly. If the original crew failed to strap everything down, a cabinet or table could easily shift during the drive. I planned to report it at the next safe place to stop. A few minutes later, the sound came again. Thump, then a dragging noise followed it. It sounded like something heavy scraping across the trailer floor. I turned down the radio and listened. For a while, there was nothing except rain and tire noise. Then I heard a long, low sound behind the sleeper. It resembled someone slowly exhaling. Huh. I glanced at the passenger seat, even though I knew I was alone. The sound came again. Huh. It wasn't loud, and it didn't seem to be coming from inside the cab. It was passing through the front wall of the trailer and into the rear of the tractor. My first thought was an air leak. I checked the gauges. Both air pressure needles were holding steady. I tapped the brakes gently. They responded normally. The sound continued at irregular intervals. Long exhale. Short pause. Another exhale. It reminded me of someone struggling to breathe. I called my dispatcher through the truck's hands-free system. He didn't answer. I called again. Still nothing. A message appeared on my dispatch screen a minute later. Keep moving. Delivery time cannot be changed. That message bothered me. I hadn't told him why I was calling. I replied that the load was shifting and I needed to inspect it. His response came almost immediately. Do not break seal. Customer must verify cargo. That was standard enough. Drivers generally shouldn't open a sealed trailer without authorization. But if a load becomes unsafe, we are allowed to stop and contact the carrier. I asked him to call me. He never did. I kept driving for another 20 minutes, looking for a well-lit truck stop. The breathing sound grew louder. Every time the trailer moved over a rough patch of pavement, I heard a thud, followed by 2 or 3 sharp taps. At one point, I was almost certain I heard a voice. It was too muffled to understand, but it sounded like someone calling out from far away. I switched on the CB radio and asked whether any drivers nearby could hear me. A man answered and said he was about half a mile behind me. I gave him my trailer number and asked whether he could see anything unusual. He said one of my rear lights was flickering, but both doors appeared closed. Then he asked why. I told him I thought my cargo had shifted. I didn't mention the breathing. He offered to follow me to the next truck stop. A rest area appeared on the highway signs before we reached one. It was only 2 miles ahead. I pulled in and parked beneath the brightest light I could find. The other driver stopped 2 spaces away. His name was Ray. He was in his 50s and had been hauling lumber through Oregon for years. We walked around the trailer together. The seal was still attached, but the plastic strip looked stretched. There were fresh scrape marks around the right door latch. Ray shined his flashlight beneath the trailer. Nothing was hanging loose. Then, we both heard it. 3 slow knocks came from inside. Knock, knock, knock. Ray looked at me. That ain't furniture, he said. I called 911. I explained that I was transporting a sealed trailer and believed there might be a person trapped inside. The dispatcher instructed us not to open the doors. Ray and I returned to our trucks and waited. The knocking became frantic. Something struck the wall several times, and a muffled voice shouted from inside. I could only understand one word: help. A state trooper arrived about 15 minutes later, followed by another patrol vehicle and an ambulance. The troopers photographed the seal and asked to see my bill of lading. One of them read it twice. He pointed to the broker's name and asked whether I had worked with that company before. I said no. He stepped away and made a phone call. When he returned, his expression had changed. He said the broker listed on the paperwork had gone out of business almost 2 years earlier. The seal was cut under police supervision. The troopers opened the right door first. The smell that came out wasn't what I expected. It wasn't the smell of old furniture or damp clothing. It was sweat, mildew, urine, and something chemical. The trailer appeared full from floor to ceiling. Mattresses, broken cabinets, cardboard boxes, rolled carpets, and garbage bags had been packed tightly near the doors. At first, it looked like the manifest had been accurate. Then, one of the troopers noticed that the stack didn't extend very far into the trailer. It was a wall. The furniture and boxes had been arranged to hide the front half of the cargo area. The officers moved several items aside and found a narrow passage. Behind it were 6 people, 4 men and 2 women. They were sitting on the trailer floor between wooden partitions. Most looked exhausted and dehydrated. One of the men was lying on his side and struggling to breathe. An empty propane heater sat near the wall. The heater had apparently shut off hours earlier, but the trailer still contained a strong chemical odor. The paramedics believed the man had been affected by fumes and poor ventilation. Small holes had been drilled into the front wall of the trailer, probably to allow some air inside. That was the source of the breathing sound I had heard. Air was being pulled through the holes as the truck moved. Sometimes it produced a low whistle. Other times it carried the sound of the people inside coughing and breathing. The rhythmic thumps had been them hitting the wooden partition. The 6 people were taken to the hospital. The troopers questioned me at the rest area for nearly 3 hours. I showed them every message from my dispatcher and the photographs I had taken before leaving Portland. I learned that the trailer's license plate didn't match the vehicle identification number in our system. The plate belonged to another trailer owned by a company in Washington. The trailer I had picked up had been reported stolen months earlier. The people inside had apparently been promised transportation and employment. I was never told all the details, and I don't know exactly how they ended up in that trailer. What I do know is that someone had created false paperwork and used a legitimate freight company to move them. My dispatcher disappeared before the police could question him. The company later claimed he had been an independent contractor using a false name. I'm not sure whether that was true or whether they were protecting themselves. A week after the incident, an investigator sent me a copy of the handwritten document found inside the hidden compartment. It wasn't a shipping manifest. It was a list of first names, ages, phone numbers, and small amounts of money written beside each person. Some of the names had lines drawn through them. At the bottom of the page were the words, 6 received, 4 still missing. That sentence stayed with me. The 6 people found in my trailer were alive. But according to that list, they weren't the only ones who had been transported. No one could tell me what happened to the other 4. I resigned from that company before the investigation ended. For months afterward, I couldn't pull a sealed trailer without thinking about that night. I would check every document carefully. I would compare the plate, trailer number, seal, weight, and pickup address. If anything looked wrong, I refused the load. Some dispatchers complained. A few called me difficult. I didn't care. Drivers are taught not to open sealed cargo, but we're also responsible for the vehicle behind us. That night, 6 people were only a few feet away from me, hidden behind broken furniture and false paperwork. Had I ignored the sounds and continued all the way to Klamath Falls, the man who was struggling to breathe might not have survived. I still drive through Oregon. I still drive in heavy rain. But whenever I hear something move inside a trailer that is supposed to be secure, I don't turn up the radio anymore. I stop. I call someone. And I make sure the cargo listed on the manifest is the only cargo I'm actually carrying. Because sometimes the most dangerous load isn't the one written on the paperwork. It's the one someone worked very hard to make the driver forget. And that's it for tonight. The road feels different when you're alone, miles from the nearest town, with nothing but heavy rain and darkness surrounding your truck. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, subscribe and leave a like. We're here every week with more realistic, atmospheric horror. And don't forget, this Saturday night at 10 p.m., we're releasing a special 8-story deep rain compilation made especially for the truckers listening out there. Until then, stay alert, stay safe on the road, and if you hear something moving behind you, don't assume it's just the cargo. I'll see you in the next one.